Good afternoon, Steve. You are on,
Good
you're listening
afternoon,
to,
Jason.
good afternoon. You are listening to Many Moving Parts. My name is Jason Pollick, and I am a registered social worker and psychotherapist. And today I have the great pleasure of sitting down with an old friend and a previous colleague, and this is Steve Zytveld. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for inviting me on. And hello to everyone out there in internet land. Where did you want me to start?
Well, so Steve, the reason why I wanted to interview you is that you and I, aside from sharing a birthday in common, you and I also have had the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you and I think, have different flavors of it. You have PTSD from a particular event, and I have what is usually referred to as complex PTSD, which is not necessarily one singular event, but a series of events that accumulated over time that led to my diagnosis of PTSD. So, where I would like to start is I would like to start with just a little introduction of yourself, sort of who you are and what you do and what Steve is all about.
Well, I am at present what I'm doing is I'm first of all I am an ordained deacon as opposed to a priest in the Anglican Church of Canada. I don't have very much involvement right now in parish life, but I am kept busy as a community chaplain in the Carlington neighborhood of West End, Ottawa, and it's a low income housing neighborhood. It has a history and a reputation for being well, it's a community of marginalized peoples.
Mhm.
So it is, due to ethnicity, due to gender identity, income. Many people there are addicts. Uh, most if not all people there are dealing with some form of mental condition, whether it is ongoing, such as schizophrenia, whether it is itself due to a particular trauma or a particular series of traumas, and often the actual condition of being marginalized, of facing systemic discrimination, is itself uh, a trauma. So
Absolutely.
that's essentially my day job. And I mean, I meet clients. Well, I we use the word neighbor instead of client
Oh,
because
okay.
on the one hand, well, it's less bureaucratic. It's
Hmm.
a little less clinical, but at the same time, it also speaks to uh, our uh, our the fact that it's an actual ministry with a spiritual under undergirding foundation. It is
Hmm.
we The actual chaplaincy is supported by uh, around 10 community organizations and mostly church congregations. So supported financially, supported uh, in a community and a spiritual sense. So
Hmm.
we are we are our own little rebel outpost outside of the larger empire of church land.
I can see
So,
that suiting you. I can see that suiting you to a T. That sounds like it would be right up your alley.
well, more than one person has observed that if I were in a standard parish setting, especially in, well, it's a standard traditional parish setting, I would be absolutely bored. And within a
Mm.
year, I would start throwing things at the neighbors' houses just to stir up something to do for me.
And again,
So
I could totally see you doing that.
so A lot of people can, or at
Yeah,
least
yeah.
a lot of people I know.
You're the type of person that needs to be kept an eye on for sure, for sure.
Yes.
So Steve,
But
can you?
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, no,
I was
you
just going
go.
to add, and my other paying job is I'm an on-call spiritual care worker at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. And
Mm,
I'll have more words about that because the nature of hospital ministry has changed or has been the process of changing tremendously over the last 10 years.
mhm, mhm. Well, and I do want to circle back to that because, hospital ministry, and particularly with kids, at the Children's Hospital, I would imagine, for me at least, and I don't know about you, but for me, I could see that being a real trigger potentially for my PTSD.
Yes, and it's something that I have not yet. I've only been there for a half year. I have not yet encountered um, truly awful, nasty, horrible, no good things. And for that,
Okay.
I'm thankful. But when they've happened, they've been on someone else's shift, and because of the changing nature of hospital ministry, I'll sidebar. Um, Whereas until about 10 years ago, hospital ministry involved a parish minister, parish priest, volunteers wandering the halls with a little cart that said, well, that was, full of tracts and Bibles, checking in and saying, how are you doing? Just to
Mhm.
let you know, we love you, which is very nice. It's very pleasant, but increasingly over the last few years, hospital ministry has shifted the role of the chaplain to being more as a part of the actual care team, along with
Okay.
the surgeons, nurses, and my department is more aligned with the social work department.
Okay.
So there was one incident that I missed because the social worker got there first.
Mm.
So now I have to start getting to the hospital faster just so I can be ahead of the social workers.
Just so you can jump ahead. Well, and as a social worker, I just, we're not in competition. We're all
I
on the
know,
same
but
side.
I know, but
But it's nice to get there first. No, I know. I know.
yeah, yeah.
So, Steve, I'm wondering if you would be able to tell us what was the event that kind of led to your PTSD, and of course, I don't need to let you know that you only need to describe that in as much detail as you feel comfortable doing. Sometimes I know talking about traumatic events can sort of re-traumatize people, so I certainly wouldn't want to do that. So, if you could tell us what happened to you.
Actually, pardon me. It my I love the word you used, flavor.
Mm.
My flavor of PTSD is actually complex
Oh, is it?
because
Okay.
it's well we I haven't had the chance to get into all this with you, so this is here it is,
This is the chance.
live from the floor.
Hmm.
Uh, it's a it I like to think I tend to think of it more as an onion shaped series of circumstances, events, and effects. I was first diagnosed with PTSD in the spring of 1998. And it was the result of a very intense year and a half that had just passed. Because at that time, I was studying for my bachelor in English at Carleton University here in Ottawa. And so my school year started September 1996. It was a beautiful fall. And then at the end of October, um, my union for my workplace was locked out over collapsed contract talks. Now, at this time, I was studying semi full-time, a little bit more than part-time. So I would be at school in class at Carleton during the day until about 3:30, and then I would walk off campus, cross the Rideau Canal at Hartwell Locks, and walk across the fields of the experimental farm or through the arboretum to this smallish laboratory building just off of Carling, just across from the Civic Hospital. And I would be there pretty well by myself from 4 p.m. until midnight, and I would do my homework, I would read, I would do 3 patrols every evening, do a walk around the building, which would take 15 minutes. So I was paid to be a student. And then the lockout threw everything into disarray. Complete massive emotional impact on me, because I didn't know if I would have a job at the end of this. I didn't know, and I had, by that point, I had already been at that work site for 4.5 years. So I was very attached to it, very part of it. And so that dragged on from October 26th, 1996 to October 4th, 1997. So it was a 49-month labor dispute. I was trying to keep on my courses. Obviously, my grades had been affected. They sagged. And halfway through all of this, my dad had a near fatal heart attack. And he was treated at the Civic Hospital right across Carling Avenue from my workplace. And and I witnessed picket line violence. The guy who would be the best man at my wedding sometime later was hit by a car driven by a scab. So uncertainty, existential dread, self-doubt. But I got the phone call in the last week of September saying, "Hey, we're going back." And I was like, how am I going to manage that? Because when my dad had that heart attack, Kathy and I, who had been living together for a year by that point and had been dating for 4 years.
It is.
We decided, to hell with it. If we wait until we're ready, we're going to be 93 years old. So we just bit the bullet, called in every favor we could, and we had set the wedding date for the 4th of October of 1997, which was the day that the lockout would officially end. So we were actually going to be on our honeymoon when I would be going back to work. And to top it all off, Kathy was facing layoff a few weeks after we would get married. So there's the I'm going to say, in my description of my PTSD, that's the sort of centerpiece. That's where I begin.
That's the stage that was set.
Yeah. And so in March of 1998, with all of that seemingly behind me, and just a couple months after that massive ice storm that we had in early 1998, I couldn't do things. I couldn't think. I couldn't read. All I wanted to do was sleep or stare into space. And Kathy said, this is a problem. So she hauled me into the doctor's office. I explained my situation, and my doctor went through the checklist and asked me with a straight face, point blank. She asked me how many tours I had done in Bosnia,
Mm.
and I said none. I'm not a soldier. I'm a long-haired hippie, tree-hugging, dope-smoking peace freak. So I was booked off of work for 2 months, and I spent those 2 months hanging out at the house, getting out and seeing friends. Very therapeutic.
Mhm.
And I thought that would pretty well be it.
Mm.
Now, in there have been a couple of there had been a couple of massive triggering events after that. In Okay, quick timeline, because and let me know if at any point you get lost in my narrative, because I have to keep a certain sense of chronology, because I was a part-time student at Carleton. I studied there between September of 1991 and June of 1999. That's when I finished my BA in English, and then I went on to do my MA in English at Carleton. So that went from the fall of 1999 until the summer of 2001.
Mm.
And I spent the next 8 years basically being a cultural worker here in Ottawa, running a small publishing house, running a publicly accessible um, uh, reading poetry reading series, participating in the music scene, other aspects of Centertown, Ottawa's culture, and that
Mhm.
was really cool. Now, in September of 2009, I began studies at St. Paul uh, in theology in the Anglican Studies program, and I studied there from, again, September 2009 until June of 2019. You can sort of see a pattern here. When I go to school, I'll study part-time, work full-time, and really make an almost Joseph Campbell-like hero's journey out of it. When I was at Carleton, my focus was Chaucer and other Middle English poets.
Mhm.
And so just to tell you how I got to St. Paul. Uh, so in late November of 1995, I was there at the security desk of my little lab building on the north edge of the experimental farm. And I was reading a passage from The Vision of Piers Plowman by William Langland. It's a late 14th century massive apocalyptic poem. And when I say apocalyptic, I don't mean the end of the world. It's just it's a vision. It's it's a revelatory revelatory um,
Revelatory?
revelatory. Thank you. It's my sinus condition. Makes
We'll blame
makes
it on
me
that.
makes me a little bit slower than I should be.
Well, I don't know. I
And
mean, you went on to do a master's in English and, having trouble speaking it, but maybe a PhD.
I'd like to do a PhD eventually. But and I had been an atheist until that point in my life. It wasn't that I had an aversion to the spiritual, to the transcendent, to religion. It just didn't compute for me.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, it was all the cliche metaphors you can think of. the scales fell from my eyes, etc.,
I
etc., etc.
saw the light. Yeah.
It wasn't, well, it was not something. No, we'll go with that. It was clarity.
Mm.
Uh, it was, it just all suddenly made sense. My professor at the time uh, was an ex-Anglican who had switched over to the Russian Orthodox Church because he had, in the early 80s, because he had objected to female ordination.
Mm.
But I went to him. He was the first person who I could tell about this. And so he, for the next few years, he was sort of like my spiritual rock. Um, so during the lockout, I was baptized, confirmed, and married in the Anglican Church. That's just the church that made the most sense to me at the time.
Mm.
That all happened, all three of those happened during the labor dispute. So that was something else that was going on. And to top it all off, this professor who he had a severe brain aneurysm. Uh, the day that I was baptized, and when I went to see him 2 weeks later, he amazingly survived and lived for another 10 years.
Mm.
He said, "Stephen, I'm so sorry I missed your baptism, but I promise I will be at your ordination," which
Mm.
was another, whoa, that's no, that's not where I'm going. So, but he was my Middle English professor, and he became my mentor, and he was my thesis advisor for my master's. And he did pass away on Holy Saturday, 10 years after the day I was baptized. And
And
so,
Steve, sorry if I can just sort of interject. I mean, I'm
absolutely,
starting to see a little bit about kind of what was going on. I mean, I know that there was a crash that you witnessed, and I guess that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I wasn't aware of all this backstory, but I'm seeing, a period of spiritual, emotional, intellectual upheaval, enlightenment, a shift from one thing to another, which is, typically, if you're doing it right, is deeply disconcerting. And then the other aspect was the labor dispute, and I think what we saw during the pandemic, you must have seen a little bit during that labor dispute, not quite that there were strikes, but just the sort of animosity on a large scale that was occurring between groups of people. Like it's, I imagine it might have been sort of a similar vibe.
I'm going to get to that. That's another layer in the trauma onion,
Hmm.
because and sort of be dragging this out, but
No, this is fascinating.
so in 2000, so September 2009, I finally got up the gumption to go to seminary, because I had, for those 2.5 years, I felt tremendously guilty that my mentor, and I had actually been his last student. He officially retired from supervising master's students uh, right after I finished my master's thesis. So he passed away eh, on Easter Saturday, uh, 2007. And for that 2.5 years, I just was like, I have to do this.
Mm.
This is the great call. So I studied at St. Paul from 2009, 2019. I landed a full-time job at the university, but I was laid off because they had closed that department. It was the bookstore.
Mm.
And there, the the symptoms reemerged. Just the inability to do anything, because not only was I laid off, but I was the one who essentially shut off the lights and locked the doors to
Hmm.
to, to the bookstore. So I spent a good 2 months, again, basically out of commission. Uh, talked to a very good therapist, worked through things, and I hate saying I was patched back together because that's not really accurate, but that's just the closest metaphor I can use. And then 3 years after that, when I was president of the Students Association at the university, we had a harassment situation pop up involving the Students Association, a number of students, and even some faculty. And again, that had that massive impact, and that massive harm, that massive injury, because it was a moral injury.
Mm-hmm.
It was a severe mental injury because, again, so many of the things that I had taken to be sturdy and dependable were shaken, fractured,
Well,
etc.
and I like that
And it was
term moral injury, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people overlook when it comes to trauma and PTSD, is that it doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be an accident, or it doesn't have to be, that you were beat up or anything like that. It can be moral injury. And I think back to, again, my experiences of the pandemic. It's
Mhm.
this world that I thought was reasonably sort of kind of safe no longer is. Seeing empty shelves at the grocery store and seeing people fighting each other over, disputes over masks and vaccines and mandates and all that. It was disconcerting for me, as I'm sure it was for you. So I'm sorry. I can see where the moral injury component of this would come in.
Exactly. And just as a sidebar, I mean, I think we have only just begun to measure the depths of how we as a culture were traumatized and destabilized by the pandemic.
Well, and what doesn't help is that the world keeps piling other things on top of that. You know, Gaza and Israel, and then, Ukraine and Russia, and et cetera, et cetera.
Haiti now, but it has always been thus.
Mm, true enough.
So at the end of, so when I was receiving therapy for those experiences over the academic year of 2015 to 2016, again, I had an excellent therapist at the time, now retired.
What manner of
Someone who was
therapist was your therapist? I'm sorry, a social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist?
a psychiatrist.
Okay.
uh, had their own practice. We would meet for an hour and a half every week for about 3 months. And it was during that therapy that we really dug into the meat my of my on no of my complex repetitive PTSD.
Mm.
And we had traced uh, my condition to, and I hadn't even thought of this at the time. Like this had been completely off my radar. It had been, pushed down and back. But in late October, I believe it was the 26th of October, at around 3:15, 3:30 in the afternoon, 1986, I was on an OC Transpo bus, Route 95, westbound towards home. I was 17 at the time, and I had the bus entered the intersection of the transitway at Booth Street, and we had the green light, and the bus enters the intersection, and this front-loading garbage truck, either due to mechanical failure or negligence, T-boned the bus.
Mm.
Uh, well, T-bone may not be the right word, but broadsided. It hit more towards the front. There was that moment of everyone looking to the left as the truck bore down on us, and everybody screams, and then there's the impact and that deep silence,
The silence after.
as we came to a rest.
Mm.
The woman in front of me, the last thing I remember of her was that she was screaming about her back and she was unable to move. And the driver I couldn't see, but there was obvious evidence of him being badly injured or killed. There was blood all over the place, and I was in shock. Like, I was physically unharmed, and I was in shock.
Mm.
So I got off the bus. Of all things, I was carrying a bag from the bookstore at the Radio Center. I had just bought the radio script, or the script for the radio play Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And so I just got off the bus, and I got on the next bus as the fire trucks and police cars and ambulances were arriving, and went home. And I got home, and because I was still I still had a paper route at this time, I was yelled at for getting home late.
Mm.
And over the next few weeks, I shut down. Dissociation. My digestive system went absolutely insane. Nothing stayed in place. I was constant abdominal pain. My immune system collapsed.
Steve, I'm sorry. I want to back up just a second to dissociation.
Absolutely.
Just because there might be people listening, and I hope that there are people listening to this who are suffering from PTSD or who feel they might be. Can you tell us a little bit about dissociation? Because that's a term that people might not be familiar with. What do you mean by dissociation?
In my case, it's the sense of being detached from both my own senses and my experiences of the world around me. Basically, it's like looking at everything through a slightly fuzzy window.
And was this sort of like this was sort of like your baseline, or this would happen to you at certain points in time?
This had become my baseline.
Okay, because I dissociated as well, but only during particular events. I remember probably the worst dissociation I ever had. I had two children under the age of 3. My son was 3, and I think my daughter was 1, or around thereabouts. And I used to get up early to let my wife sleep in because she had spent, most of the night nursing. And something happened, and both the kids were screaming, and I had no window of tolerance, right? Like the usual, area where you can deal with your stress was very narrow for me. These kids started howling, and I just checked out. My wife came out of the bedroom, I think 10 minutes after the howling started, or 5 minutes after the howling started. And normally a parent would do something about that, but I was just staring vacantly out the window at the birds. And she sort of tapped my shoulder, and eventually I sort of came back into my body. But it's that same thing, like I was watching a movie, of my own life, just this total detachment. So that's, we both experienced that dissociation.
Yes. Thank you for that, by the way.
You're welcome.
That's That's
It's a disconcerting experience to not be in your own body, like to not feel like you have command over your own faculties. Like, I mean, I'm super glad. Like, honestly, it was nothing. I think somebody dropped a piece of toast. You know what I mean? But I'm glad that it wasn't something serious, like one of them was bleeding or on fire or something like that. Because would I have checked out as well? I don't know.
yeah,
So
yeah.
sorry, so you were dissociating,
Well, I
you were
get
having
that.
all sorts of you were having all sorts of physical impacts as well. Digestion was upset.
Yes, very, yeah. And uh, at one point, because like this was even affecting my vision. So I was sent to an ophthalmologist about 3 weeks later, and uh, blood tests were done, tests of my eye muscles, and uh, like he when he got the results from the lab, he sat me down and said, "So, do you use intravenous, or do you do you have sex with other men?" You know, because this was 86. This was
Hmm.
the height of the AIDS crisis, because my immune system had collapsed that badly.
And still a lot of misinformation about it at the time, of course.
Yes. And, you know, exactly. Uh, so it was, I left school because I just couldn't do anything. I just wasn't there. And to top it all off, or not to top it all off, and another thing is, until early November 1986, when I had been a kid, the idea of smoking cigarettes was abhorrent. Like, it was, to me, it was detestable. I thought, who would be so stupid as to do that? And then after this incident, I began smoking.
Hmm.
That was another part of my trauma response. And so that over that year, I basically picked myself up, and I mean, not having any idea that this had been trauma, that this had been PTSD. My doctor thought it was some sort of a digestive tract infection that had come about because I was, drinking too much soda pop, eating too much candy, all the things that, you know, misidentified it. And so I eventually went back to high school, finished a couple years later, and got on with my life, with this being under the surface. And let's see, I'm trying not to get ahead of myself here. So those are four of the major trauma events in my life so far.
Hmm.
The next one I'm going to tackle was exactly the pandemic, because uh, again, it was disorienting, it was disruptive. Everything was, everything just everything just went
Well,
went
and
screw up.
we were losing family members and friends, not only to the pandemic itself, but just due to the animosity. I'm talking about people who are still alive, who, I have had friends unfriend me on social media and relatives stop talking to me because of my stance on masks and vaccines. And I mean, I was pro both of them, right? But yeah, just watching all that animosity, and I don't know. So I was diagnosed in 2020. I broke down in 2019, several months before the pandemic started. So this was really shit timing for a pandemic to happen, because already I was sort of at my worst state. And then the pandemic happened. And I don't know whether you did this or anybody else did this, but I remember looking at my phone dozens of times a day to see what the death count was at. Like, there was a website you could go to that was accumulating stats of, sort of the global death toll, and I would just watch this number mount and mount and mount. I have no idea in retrospect why I was doing that. I don't know, maybe it was just sort of, to be informed, to feel like I knew kind of what the situation was. But yeah, that was a trauma reaction for me and a bizarre one.
Actually, I get that because I've always been a news junkie, and I can't see whether or not that is related to my own trauma, but keeping informed in regard to ongoing chronic crisis situations like that uh, is is in my experience a trauma response, because it gives you at least a sense not of control but of having a handle on the situation.
Mhm.
That's just my take on it.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, no, that makes
my
sense.
my experience of the pandemic was overshadowed by the occupation of my neighborhood, downtown
Hmm.
Ottawa, by the Freedom Convoy between the end of January of 2022 and mid around the was it the 20th of February,
Hmm.
because we live in downtown Ottawa. Like I am, we live on Queen Street. I can look out my window and I can see Place de Portage and Gatineau.
So you would have heard the
So,
horns.
yes, we heard the horns. Uh, our apartment stank of burning diesel.
Mm.
I was myself assaulted by one of these people.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Uh, my wife, our goddaughters, numerous neighbors, both in our building and just in the neighborhood, were harassed, verbally threatened, etc. So it was an awful experience. And I had actually been following the progress of these people when they, from when they had set out here eastward
Mm.
from BC. And I had been following the chatter on social media. And in my opinion, I mean, some people will disagree and they're absolutely entitled to, but these were not nice people.
Mm.
These were people whose opposition to, well, I mean, it wasn't just masks and it wasn't just vaccines. A lot of things boiled over there.
There were a
Uh,
lot of frustrations that came to play there. It wasn't about one thing for sure.
no, so this was something that my wife and I were subjected to. And I'm not going to get into my wife's PTSD, but let's just say, this severely affected both of us.
I have
I
no
mean,
doubt.
again, our apartment, we're 7 floors up, and our apartment stank of burning diesel.
Hmm.
And um, if you check out my social media posts and comments and everything from that time, increasingly I'm profoundly angry,
Hmm.
and profoundly in pain. And so I got a phone call from who I'm going to refer to as my district supervisor in the Anglican Church. Got a call from his office, and they sent me into therapy right away because
Okay.
it
They
was that
knew
was
that was going to have an impact.
no, they could tell.
Mm.
They could tell. This was apparently a point of conversation for a number of a number of people who I know, and you know, you know, phone calls were made.
Hmm.
I did receive quite a bit of support from my colleagues in the Anglican diocese, and so they were aware that I was in pain, and
We're
my
supportive.
yeah, support was there, and I was sent into therapy with an excellent therapist here in Ottawa. And it's there that my problem with authority, because what I've noticed is that oftentimes cases of trauma are either begun with or are worsened um, by by problems with authority structures.
Mm-hmm.
We'll hear about soldiers home from the battlefield, and all of a sudden, all their buddies have gone off to their lives. Veterans Administration type organizations don't come through for them. So what has been initially traumatic becomes a lot more complex. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like that for me. Not just either a crisis or chronic situation, but it's the feeling that, the people the systems, the structures that that are there to, or should be there to support me weren't.
Well, and sorry, just to interrupt, I mean, the other thing to not to forget that happened during the pandemic was the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? I had some Afghanistan vets,
Yes.
in my friendship circle, and that was deeply, deeply disturbing for them. I mean, in all of the time and trouble and lives, that were spent over there, and the Taliban swept into power again in roughly 8 seconds.
Yeah.
So it's just like, why did all of this happen? So I mean, again, the authority figures and structures not being there, on one hand, authority structures are often sort of coercive and controlling, and then on the other hand, when they're supposed to control a situation and they are absent, that's another thing that sort of undermines trust.
Yes. Yes. And it's again why I have my suspicions of authority.
Hmm.
And that is and that goes back to my trauma onion, as I like to say, because it's been a journey of discovery, but a lot of it has been through hindsight and reconsideration.
Hmm.
Because when I was in therapy for dealing with the occupation of downtown Ottawa, I mean, for God's sakes, these people were pissing on the war memorial, and they were
Hmm.
they were, as I like to say, voiding their tripes on our sidewalks. Anyways,
Hmm.
sidebar done. The something that my therapist at the time happened upon is I've probably been dealing with trauma for my entire life.
Hmm.
And that is because I'm an adoptee.
Okay.
Uh,
Another thing I
I,
didn't know about you.
I'm a man full of mysteries and surprises.
Indeed.
No, there's well, well, you never brought it up. But
It's not the sort of question you randomly ask someone. Usually somebody else brings that up.
oh, are you adopted? How could you tell? Oh, I can just tell.
Hmm.
But I mean, adoption itself is a trauma.
Yes.
And uh, after discussing this with my therapist, she just looked up from her notepad and said, "How old were you when you were adopted?" And I said, "I was 28 days." She said, "So for 28 days, you were essentially by yourself in an orphanage. You know, they fed you. I hope they fed you. They had a place for you to sleep. You had a roof over your head. But who was holding you and taking care of you, talking to you, all those things that a mother does?" So that is that that was a massive revelation to me,
Mm.
because again, I mean, that is something I didn't even think of. And there it is. And explains everything from, senses of general alienation, not fitting in. I mean, my parents have been very good. We're an almost perfect fit, except I'm an extrovert and they aren't.
Mm.
And I live more in a world of symbols and myths and narratives and how things mysteriously managed to fit together. And my parents were products of the Great Depression and World War II, and so didn't think about these things.
Not much space for that.
No, pure Protestant work ethic through and through.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, generous, kind people, but when dealing with things that are unusual, shy away from it. Somebody who's dealing with mental illness, the first answer is, well, normal up.
Mm-hmm.
Stop acting like that. Stop it.
Cheer up. You've got nothing to be sad about. You've got no reason to be afraid. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
I've heard all that before.
I mean, 10 out of 10 for class, several million for empathy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so that's a whole series of traumas which have shaped me, and there does not pass a day when I do not thank God that all that didn't make me, because I hope it hasn't made me mean-spirited and cruel and vengeful.
I can say from personal experience that you are none of those things. And it's interesting because I didn't know that you were adopted. I thought sort of your first trauma was this crash when you were 17. And I had the order reversed. I thought that happened later to you in life. But I know for me, so I was diagnosed with PTSD, and in 2019 or 2020 thereabouts, and I ended up a year later. I can't remember the exact timeline, but 2020, 2021, around thereabouts, I ended up doing a 9-week stint at a PTSD rehab program. And so they part of the program was, sort of going a little bit back in your past and finding, your thoughts and how your thoughts affect sort of how you are behaving. And I realized during that 9-week rehab that my trauma actually extended back to when I was younger, because I think I've mentioned to you, and I know I've posted online about my experiences with bullying. And a lot of my experiences came out because I broke down as a result of trying to make too many people happy, and in my role in the church, and trying to save people who were on the street, and trying to save people who were dealing with addiction and homelessness and trauma of their own. And yeah, as I've mentioned to you, I've gone in another direction. So you started off an atheist and became a man of God, and I was a man of God and then became an atheist, and that's part of the way I am coping with it. And you and I would probably disagree on this, but I know for me, um, I have great difficulty believing in a God that would allow these things to happen. I know that's very childlike theology, but it's where I am today. Maybe sometime in the future, I will be in a different place. But I'm curious, Steve, what do you do to stay well? So you went through therapy. Do you have any, kind of daily practices or regular practices that you do, activities or behaviors that you engage in to try to stay well?
Well, the first and most obvious thing is I'm more conscious of my own health,
Mm,
because oftentimes when I had been in university, when I had been in seminary, when I had been working in any capacity, I was the sort of person who would jump out of bed in the morning, put on his clothes, run out the door, and wouldn't get around to having breakfast till at the earliest one in the afternoon. And I would, um, I wouldn't sleep very well. I would probably max at some points 5 hours per night, which was not enough for me.
mm.
So first and obvious, I spend time cooking and eating the right things. I mean, like anybody else, I need my share of bad food. You know, I do need those double bacon cheeseburgers,
I
but I
agree.
also try double bacon cheeseburger. But
Great.
I try.
Now you've got a craving going on in me. Thank you for that.
Oh, well.
It didn't take much. I mean,
Reason.
I
Well,
was already teetering on the edge of darkness. You just merely took me over there. So
actually, I was going to say it's mid-afternoon, so you do need something to eat.
mhm,
So basically meeting my own needs before anything else. And that's not being selfish, that's being braced and girded and on my feet and in the ring when I'm needed, instead of all of a sudden coming apart at the seams.
mhm.
Um, I mean I used to drink the equivalent of a 2 4 or maybe 2 per week when I was younger. And again, this goes back to trauma of adoption, trauma of the crash. Like I was self-medicating without knowing it, and I'm
Mhm.
still trying to quit smoking. I had managed to quit at the end of September 2019, and
And
then
then,
March 13th, 2020, I'm sitting in the parish office on the computer watching you know, the baseball season is canceled. Hockey is canceled. Football is canceled, even though it doesn't start for 6 months. The
mhm.
prime minister's wife has tested positive, and I'm like, well, bugger this. And went across the street to the little convenience store and bought a pack of cigarettes and lit one up on the back steps of the church. And I thought, this is
Ah, mhm.
this,
This is okay.
yeah. So I have people who I talk to on a regular basis, talking out even just the little things. Um, something bugged me on the way to work. Somebody was being goofy or something. Just like that support system. I don't have a formal spiritual director right now, but there are a couple of clergy with the congregations who support my chaplaincy, who I talk to on a regular basis.
Mhm.
Um, making sure that I have that support system in place, and really being grateful for what I'm doing. Like I said, I'm so thankful that I'm not a mean, cynical, brittle uh, person, because I could have very easily ended up like that.
You could have become a fragile white male.
I could be, yes. I had to stop before I made unnecessary political comments about various party leaders and candidates in Western democracies. But
Indeed,
no,
indeed.
and that is my own story of hope or redemption or whatever, that I could have been Anakin Skywalker. I
Mhm.
could right now, if things had fallen out wrong, I could have been at this point in my life on the board of directors of a major petrochemical corporation in Alberta.
Mhm.
I could have done a lot of things with my life that I walked away from, or I avoided altogether. And
But of course, Anakin redeemed himself in the end. I mean, it was a deathbed confession, but nonetheless, valid.
well, as the Dutch say, better late than never.
Do they say that?
No, they don't.
Fair enough. Somebody does, though. So, Steve, what is there something that you wish you had known when all of this started happening? Because I know that one thing that I wish I knew was that PTSD is not something that is restricted to soldiers, police officers, first responders, nurses, and doctors in ERs. Like, I wish I had known that university students and people who have been adopted and racial minorities or people with different gender or sexual identities who've been marginalized, or priests, or accountants, anybody can have PTSD. Anybody, and lots of people do in fact have trauma that is unresolved. I wish somebody had told me that, because I have spent the better part of my adult life dealing with my experiences being bullied, and I wish someone had told me, that was trauma, and that needs to be processed. So that's what I wish someone had told me. Is there something that you wish someone had told you?
Uh, I'm going to tell you another short story, if I may.
You may.
And in September 2019, when I had just begun studies at St. Paul, two of my very good friends, they're both writers based here in Ottawa. My birthday's in early October. I just started seminary, and they said, well, let's take Steve out and get him drunk, and we're going to have fun and, celebrate him being in seminary and his birthday. And so they took me to this little, not quite dive bar, but certainly not, it certainly wasn't the Knickerbocker Club or
Dive-ish.
whatever. It was authentic and neighborhood bar. And so we settled in, and they introduced me to the regulars, because this wasn't my stomping grounds. And there was at the bar, there was this youngish, I'd say he's about 5 years younger than me. And keep in mind, this is 15 years ago now. Youngish Indigenous man who had been apparently there since before we got there. And word had started to get around the bar that it was, not only was it my birthday, but I had gone to Jesus camp. I was in seminary. I was trained to be a man of the cloth. And so, come and see the freak who's drinking, who's drinking away while he's going to be a man of God. It's, comic relief.
Getting it all out of his system before he has to hand it all over to Jesus, eh?
Yeah. And this guy was at the bar, and he heard this, and he was, as the evening wore on, he was increasingly angry. He was increasingly antagonistic. And at one point he confronted me, and he said, why are you going to work for an institution that tried to destroy me and my family and my people?
Valid question.
Very valid question. And now I started with the sort of typical white person, white guy answer of, I cannot take blame for that. I just can't. I kind of got the shitty end of the stick myself in various systems. But instead of saying, I can't take blame for that, my response continued with, I cannot take blame for that, but I can take responsibility for where we go from here. What happened to you should not have happened. And I am sorry about that. I cannot put into words how sorry I am and how still sorry I should be.
Mm.
And that's where the confrontation ended, because he said, all I've ever wanted to hear is someone just say that.
Mm.
And so when we are talking to somebody, or somebody who has been through a trauma, a traumatic experience, whether it's a crisis or a chronic situation, whether it's systemic or whether it's just a completely isolated bad thing, the thing that you need to hear is you shouldn't have gone through that. It doesn't have to be
Mhm.
much more than that. That's the starting point. And that's where seeking competent, compassionate, caring, um, seeking somebody to help you, because
Mm.
there are more people who are attuned to to trauma now than even 10 years ago.
Mhm.
When I was first diagnosed, PTSD was still commonly called shell shock.
Yeah.
It was coming out of that. I mean, the actual term post-traumatic stress disorder, I don't think even was a thing until the mid to late 80s.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, we are, as a culture, coming to terms with the fact that a lot of us are walking wounded.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
this is where authority figures, have to step up and, you know, do their freaking job.
Mm. Um, And I want to point out one thing though, just for anybody who might be listening and wondering, okay, do I have PTSD? Do I have trauma? So one of the things that I was not aware, PTSD is something that can be diagnosed formally by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and they will put you through a battery of tests. However,
Mhm.
social workers and registered psychotherapists, to the best of my knowledge, cannot. But yeah, you need to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist.
Mhm.
If you get referred to one by a doctor, it might be covered, but if you need to, it can take quite a long time to get a referral to a psychiatrist or psychologist through a doctor. So you might be better off to do that on your own. You can go to psychologytoday.com and you can look up, that's sort of like the Amazon of therapists. You can look up psychologist, psychiatrist by keyword, look for PTSD. So that's something that I didn't know when I started on this journey, but the system, I think, needs to do a better job about making it clear, how do I get from point A to point B? Where do I get from, I think I might have PTSD, to getting a formal diagnosis, getting medicated if appropriate, and also seeking treatment. So, Steve, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but I want to end on a particular question, because I don't know how you experienced your PTSD, but when I broke down, I thought I was finished. Man, I thought I was done. Like, I thought I was never going to work again. I thought I was never going to be able to be an effective and loving husband to my wife or father to my children. Um, I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life basically curled up in my bedroom, watching, videos of people getting into skateboarding accidents, because for some reason I watched a lot of those while I was in recovery from PTSD. So now,
Mhm.
of course, gainfully employed, much better connections with my wife and children and my parents than I ever had. And I won't say I'm back to normal. I will say I'm different. But I'm happy with who and where I am and what I have accomplished. So I just wondered if you had a message of hope for somebody who might be in that dark pit of, shit, this is what I'm dealing with. These are the feelings of depression and anxiety and hypervigilance,
Mhm.
feeling like everything is a threat. I remember there was a period where I couldn't go to the grocery store
Mm.
because um, just the long aisles, if I would get about halfway down, I would panic because it was too far for me to duck into another direction. And I figured out that was because while I was working for the church, some belligerent people had blocked doorways several times.
Mhm.
And I'm like, this is why I feel trapped. So, for people who are in that dark pit, what is a message of hope that you could give them?
You know, that's a question I always puzzle over because it if you get the care that you need, if you have the support around you, uh, you will get through it. And that's a tall order. Like you and I have been enormously blessed in
Mm.
that we have these resources.
Yes.
Uh, and they are there. I mean, and again, these are relatively new. Like this is a relatively new awareness in our culture.
Hmm.
Uh, but but at the same time, these resources are becoming more and more plentiful and prevalent. We are becoming a lot kinder to people who are dealing with mental injury like this.
Hmm.
Uh, like like just a few years ago, if I talked about my PTSD with someone, the reaction wasn't, "Oh no, don't tell me about that. I don't believe that." But their reaction was more like, "Are you okay talking about this?"
Hmm.
There is a lot of compassion out there. There is, and it's becoming more so now that we understand better, not just the condition, but the situations that lead to it,
Hmm.
and how really it's not that difficult to bring somebody back in from their PTSD pit or vortex.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, that's not really a note of hope so much as a call to everyone who are surrounding a person who has been traumatized. Taking the time to not say things like, "Oh, you'll get over it. Here, have another
Hmm.
drink," you know, but also to the person who suspects that they're dealing with trauma, reach out. There are a lot more of us out there than you think.
There are, and I find one of the things that was helpful for me, because you're right, because PTSD doesn't just affect the individual who is suffering from it, it affects their entire friendship circles and their families. And there are a lot of resources out there now that I think are very helpful in getting people to understand what PTSD is about and what you can expect and what the causes of it are. I mean, I know, my wife picked up a copy of PTSD for Dummies. I mean, there's a dummies book for everything, and
Mm.
the dummies books are never the last word on any subject, but they're quite often the first word on a lot of subjects, and it was very accessible for her as the dummies books tend to be. So that was helpful for her to understand a bit about what I was going through. So. I think you're right. I think there are a lot more resources, a lot more awareness, and that is something to be happy about.
There is also an Episcopal priest in Texas named David W. Peters, and he was a chaplain in the Iraq War, and his books he's written at least 3 books that deal with trauma, post trauma,
Mm,
and from a spiritual perspective. If you're given to that, like I am, I haven't had the chance to dig into them to the degree that I'd like to, but that's just one example of the of increasing acceptance and awareness and the need the
mm,
need to care. So that's that's there is hope. It's out there. We
mm.
love you, whoever you are suffering.
Indeed. Well,
So,
Steve, on that note, I really want to thank you for spending this time with me and spending this time with whoever might be listening to this podcast. I want to thank you for being so vulnerable and transparent. Um, I've appreciated everything that you've said, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
well, it's been a pleasure. Again, thank you for inviting me. Jason, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And
Always a pleasure to visit with my birthday buddy.
yes, my twin, 6 years removed.
October 1st. October 1st. Mark that date, and that's the birthday that Steve and I share. And yeah, feel free to get us a little present.
Yes, please. Also, send a kind message to Jimmy Carter. Lord willing, he's still around this coming 1st of October. And
That's true. I forgot that Jimmy
Willie
Carter has that
Andrews.
birthday.
And think a kind thought for Walter Matthau.
Indeed. May he rest in peace. Steve, thank you very much. You have a great rest of your day.
Jason. And you too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.